Yeah, I couldn't believe that we could get that many people in this building at the end of November, and that we would create an event that would rival the 4th of July fireworks. But thank you for everybody involved. It was just incredible to experience it. Well, have you ever heard of Thomas Chisholm? Well, I hadn't until preparing for today. Thomas was born in a log cabin in Franklin, Kentucky in 1866, which is near the border of Kentucky and Tennessee. In fact, there's a photo above Franklin is right in the center. His family was poor. In fact, they were dirt poor. He was educated in a rural schoolhouse, and he didn't get past elementary school. But Thomas was intelligent and ambitious, and he loved words. And by age 21, he was an associate editor for the local newspaper. 6 years later, at the age of 27, Thomas became a follower of Jesus. Now, he couldn't wait to use his passion and his gifts for God, and so he moved to Louisville, Kentucky, and became the editor of the Pentecostal Herald. But something was stirring in him, and in 1902, at the age of 36, he became a pastor. You see, he believed that in this new chapter, the door would open for him to use his gifts more fully. Sadly, his health began to decline and got so bad that within a year that he had to leave ministry in order to provide for his family. And he moved to New Jersey, where he opened an insurance business. For the rest of his life, he battled health and financial struggles as a result of his medical bills. But despite the struggle, he never lost his love for words and continued to write poems, submitting them to various publications along the way. And it was Thomas Chisholm who wrote the words, "Great is thy faithfulness, great is thy faithfulness. Morning by morning new mercies I see. All I have needed, thy hand hath provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me." Now, those words were inspired from words from the Old Testament book of Lamentations and chapter 3. And they were inspired, and here's the words that came from. "The thought of my suffering and homelessness is bitter beyond words. I will never forget this awful time as I grieve over my loss. Yet I still dare to hope when I remember this. The faithful love of the Lord never ends. His mercies never cease. Great is his faithfulness. His mercies begin afresh every day." Those words inspired Thomas to write one of the most incredible hymns of, I would say, recent, the last 100 or so years. Now, when Thomas was 75, he wrote this, reflecting on his life. He said, "My income has not been large at any time due to impaired health, which has followed me until now. Although I must not fail to record here the unfailing love of God, and that he's given me many wonderful displays of providing care, for which I am filled with astonishing gratefulness." Chisholm's words proclaim the faithfulness of God all his days. And in spite of one challenge after another, here we are 100 years later singing the words to that much-loved song. And no, I haven't written a poem or a hymn. I join Chisholm in celebrating the faithfulness of God in my own life. And that's what we're going to do today, is we're celebrating God's faithfulness because we serve a faithful God. And he is faithful in seasons of our challenge, like Thomas Chisholm experienced. And he's faithful in moments of blessing, like we're celebrating today as a church. And he's faithful in the in-between moments, seasons where we're waiting for him to move and to act. And by the way, I want to pause to thank Rob Yonan, one of our pastors, for this opening sermon illustration. It was my desire that Rob would preach this message today because Rob has walked through many seasons with Jesus, and he's experienced God's faithfulness. Rob is a man that I trust and respect. But he got sick this week, and so I got tagged to jump in. And the good news is he's recovering well. He's just worshiping with us from home. By the way, if you look at the Grace Fishers app notes, you're going to see app notes that do not look quite like this message, since I, again, get to jump in. But whatever season we find ourselves, it's important for God's people to remember his faithfulness, because remembering and celebrating God's faithfulness in the past helps us move into the future with confident expectation. Remember and celebrating God's faithfulness in the past helps us move into the future with confident expectation. It's what we did as a church when we celebrated a little over a year ago, our one-year anniversary as an independent congregation. There was a lot of joy, there was a lot of laughter, and we remembered a lot of stories. One of my favorite stories, and I'm not going to tell the whole thing that we celebrated that day, was when we remembered celebrating Twinkie Communion. Now, if you weren't there or you don't remember the story, you can go back to August 1st, 2022 and listen to it. But in short, we ran out of communion one Sunday, and one of our elders went backstage to pull out the extra communion, and it was still frozen, and all he could find was Twinkies. So a few of us celebrated Twinkie Communion. It's one of my favorite stories. But in that first service, we use Psalm 66 as our guide, and it says this: "Come and see what our God has done, what awesome miracles he performs for his people." And you see in Psalm 66, it goes on to celebrate God's faithfulness to his people. And the psalm writer remembers an event that had happened several hundred years earlier in the history of the Jewish people, as they were escaping from enslavement in Egypt, and they came across to them an obstacle that was insurmountable. They were faced with an Egyptian army on one side and the Red Sea on the other, and God created a way through, and they escaped. And the psalm writer wanted to remember God's faithfulness, to encourage the people that in those moments when we find ourselves facing challenge and difficulty, that God shows up. And we also want to remember those moments of waiting where we haven't yet seen God show up. In Psalm 5, verses 2 and 3, the psalmist, a different psalmist, King David, says this. He says, "Listen to my cry for help, my King and my God, for I pray to no one but you. Listen to my voice in the morning, Lord. Each morning I bring my request to you, and I wait expectantly." You see, when we don't yet see God at work and we're waiting and we're wondering, he invites us to bring our request to him and to wait expectantly. And we need to do that both individually and corporately. So I wonder what your story of personal faithfulness to God is. What are some of those events or those moments in your life that you've seen God show up in a special way? What blessings do you need to remember, or the way that God met you in a season of waiting? And again, I wish we had time to share those, but one of the things that I've started to do over the past year is I've created what I've called the Psalms playlist. As I read through these Psalms and one really strikes my heart or kind of connects with a moment, I simply either journal about it, and then I actually created a Psalms playlist in my phone, just a note where I can simply write the number of the Psalm and just a few brief words about the way the Psalm spoke to me. And it's important for me because in moments when I don't see God at work, I can go back to that and I can remember those moments. Or when I've got a friend that needs to remember God's moments, I can quickly find a psalm that speaks to their challenge or their need. Because we need to continue to remember God's faithfulness in the past and celebrate it, because it helps us move into the future with confident expectation. And again, I'm sure if we had an open mic time, we could share for hours about the ways that God has worked in your life and my life and the life of this church. But this morning, I want to take one moment from our past, and probably some of you were here at this moment and others may not have been a part of us yet. And actually, this moment began before Grace Fishers launched more than 10 years ago. The then pastoral leadership team at Grace was pondering launching Grace Fishers, and we were beginning to look for a place to meet for this new potential campus, looking for a building to purchase. And at first, we felt like we had found the perfect location. It was on the east side of I-69, just south of 116th Street. And I was one of the ones that found that building and felt like it was perfect for what we needed. It was a building that had been sat vacant for a number of years, and we got so excited about it. But after months of working and trying to work a deal, the deal fell through. which, by the way, that building would have been across the street from IKEA, which you would have had Swedish meatballs, but it also would have had parking and everything else would have been nuts. So while there was disappointment, we began to look again, and we found another parcel, and this was one on the west side of I-69, and it seemed to be a pretty good option. And so we got excited, and we started to work a deal, and again, the deal fell through. And I remember being disappointed the second time, but waiting and saying, okay, God, how do we regroup? How do we begin to look at all the options? And so we looked at 5 or 6 different options. And then we found a site that was on the corner of 126th and Oleo. It was a site that had some challenges. There were 6 different parcels that a realtor had been putting together for several years. In fact, I think there were like 20 different property owners. You can see on the screen some of those parcels. And my first thought was, when I saw this, I'm like, this is too far east, because at that point, Oleo Road was kind of the end of the earth, at least at the end of Fishers. You know, I'm not sure there was anything east of Oleo Road. But as we began to look at it, God began to confirm that this was the place. And I remember, and I actually looked back to some notes that I made this week, but I remember the first time that I walked this land in March of 2014, and we didn't own the land yet, but I was walking the 24 acres because I wanted to kind of get a glimpse of what this was. We were working on the purchase agreements again. It was, again, kind of our third time, but I was trying to capture, what is it about this land? Is there something special about it? And how do you capture 24 acres with a camera? Didn't have a drone. It would have been cool to have a drone footage. But as I was getting ready to leave the property, I snapped a couple of more pictures. And I looked at those pictures later, and this is the picture that I looked at. And when I saw the picture blown up a little bit, there were 2 things that jumped out. And it's interesting to reflect back on these pictures, especially with where we're at in this moment, because I noticed 2 things. I didn't notice them in the moment that I took the pictures. And the first thing was, I noticed that in the forefront of the picture, it was a farmer's field. And I began to reflect, because it was a field that was about ready to get planted. It was that time of year, and planting is an act of faith for a farmer, because they begin to plow the field and prepare it, and then they plant the seeds, but they can't make the seeds germinate or grow. They can't bring the rains or the right amount of sunshine. There's no guarantee of outcome. But a farmer sows a field in faith, and he takes steps of faith. And I just began to think about the kinds of steps of faith that this new congregation, because by the time we purchased this land, we were a congregation. And I began to think about the kinds of steps and the seeds that we would need to plant in the lives of people, and the seeds of faith that we would plant in the lives of our community. But then the second thing that struck me about this picture, and you can see it in the background, and you probably can't read it, but you see HSE High School. And I began to think about the perspective that we need to continue to have as a church, that the perspective isn't us looking in at our church, but it's us looking out at the community that God has planted us in the middle of. There's a high school across the street. There's 5,000 students up and down this road, and over 100,000 people in this community of Fishers. And I thought, I don't want us ever to lose the perspective that God has planted us in this place, not just for ourselves, but to bring blessing on the people and the community of the city of Fishers. You see, if I would have had it my way, we would have been locked into a corporate campus away from neighborhoods and students that we sought to serve. But God knew better. He knew better. He knew that we would be launched several years later as an independent church. He knew that this site would help us reach into the surrounding communities, into McCordsville and Fortville and Pendleton. He knew that this area was full of potential. In fact, if you read the Fishers 2040 plan, you can see that we're poised in an incredible location to impact our community. There were so many things that we didn't know, But God knew, and he still does, and we need to remember that as we move into the next season of a journey as a church. You see, remembering and celebrating God's faithfulness in the past helps us move into the future with confident expectations. And so we need to remember moments like that God led us to this place, and we need to remember moments like today, which is a marker moment, another one of those marker moments in the history of Grace Fishers as we celebrate what God has done through the Reach Initiative, one that we're all going to celebrate in together. You see, God has been faithful before, and he's not going to be stopped being faithful to us. He's been faithful to you and to me and to his church broadly. Great is his faithfulness. And so we're going to transition to this moment where we celebrate Reach, and I want to invite Joey and Wendy, and they're two of our pastors. The three of us make up our leadership team at Grace Fishers. These are two people that it's been a joy to serve with over these past 2.5 years in this role. And so they're going to help us celebrate some numbers here today. There's two things that I want you to keep in mind. We had two challenges as a church. First was we wanted to invite the congregation to commit to who were the specific people that you were going to pray for, that you were going to begin to invest your life in, are ones. There was a relational commitment. And the second thing was a financial commitment that we were asking our congregation in faith to help us prepare for the future of Grace Fishers by paying down $2 million on our mortgage. So we're going to celebrate and share the results now.
All right. First, we are going to celebrate our relational commitment, as Kevin said. So these are the folks that are our ones. These are the ones that we're praying experience the hope of Jesus Christ. And so that number is 530 people. And what's even more amazing about that number is that 192 of those names that were submitted were from our kids and students. And so that's pretty cool.
We wanted to give you a way to visualize the impact, and so if you'll turn your attention to the cross, because this is really all about people experiencing the love of Jesus. And so we've got a way, there are over 530 light bulbs. There's about 600 light bulbs, and we had 530 names, but we left an extra 70 light bulbs in there because there may be people yet that God calls us to impact in our community, in our world.
Next, we want to celebrate the total number of commitments. So more than 200 individuals and families made relational or financial commitments to the Reach Initiative. And so many of you made both, and so thank you for that. And thanks for taking a step and being part of what God is doing here. We can celebrate that. More than 200 families. Yep. I got a cue to clap. And then another thing that we want to do is just take a moment and thank. So nothing around this place happens without volunteers at Grace Fishers. Nothing happens. And we had 3 volunteers in particular that helped us lead the Reach Initiative, and those people are Brittany Simmons, Jen Conkle, and Lisa Telford, and they kept Kevin in line. They helped us project manage, and implement all the steps. And so we couldn't have done it without them, so that's pretty cool.
Lastly, we want to celebrate our financial commitment. Now, I want to give you a little bit of background. We knew that this was going to be a stretch. Our original goal, and we didn't share this, but the original goal that we were planning to go for was $1.5 million. But as I wrestled with this number, I felt like God personally was asking me to take a step of faith, and he was asking us to take a step of faith as a congregation. So I knew that $2 million was going to be a stretch goal. So to share this number, I feel like we need a little drum roll here. Yeah, you got the real thing. By God's grace, friends, you committed over $2.1 million. You know, We talked about having a little light bulb. You know, people suggested a little, or not the light bulb, a little thermometer to show progress. And I asked our graphic designer, could we have a little graphic that shows the thermometer exploding? But that got nixed. So.
As the guy who looks at the numbers, so I'm the youth pastor, but also one of the youth pastors, but also the finance guy. So that's fun. And every gift mattered. So I sat in a room the day after people turned in their first round of commitment cards, and it was humbling to see people's sacrificial gifts on the card. And the amount is irrelevant because of the stories of the people that we know and the commitments that they made to their church. And so that was really cool. Another thing that was really a neat thing out of this is that over 30 new families started giving financially to Grace Fishers throughout the Reach Initiative, either to Reach or just to the General Fund of Grace. So that's worth celebrating. 30 families is a ton. And then one of my personal favorites is that we challenged our high school students to give to Reach, and they pledged to give over $10,000 to Reach themselves. So it's pretty cool.
We have a lot to celebrate, and I feel like this time needs to just end with a prayer of thankfulness, and there's a prayer that I've adapted from our Reach Discipleship Guide. And so would you pray with me, and then we're going to enter into a time of worship. God, we recognize your glory. You have been faithful throughout the years, and you have never forsaken your people. When humanity sought to cast you aside, you made a way, and you revealed yourself anew in Jesus. Thank you. And as we walk through the life with both difficulties and joys, allow us the grace to recognize your faithfulness all around us, and help us celebrate that faithfulness and experience the joy that it brings. Thank you, Lord. Hold us and keep us as you always have. Amen.